We're going to be doing a couple things this month. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to frame out our duck block that we did several months ago. So for that in your kit, you have a large piece of white fabric and you have a fat quarter of green fabric. We are going to need to trim the duck down to start with. If you've put embellishments on it, it's going to be a little bit harder. If you have a lot of embellishments on that are going to make a ruler rock, I think mine's going to be okay. But if you did, if they were standing out a lot, then you could line it up on your cutting mat. Count out. We're going to be trimming this down to 12.5 by 18.5. So 18.5 is vertical, 12.5 this way. So count out on your mat where your 12 inches is, or your 12.5. And then what I would do, I would count out the 12. Then I'd line up my 1/4 inch mark with one of the lines on one end of the 12, cut that. Then I would move over to the other side, and let's just say this was my other mark. Again, I would be lining my 1/4 inch mark up with that and slice. So then I would do the same thing. I would count out where 18 is, center it on it, and then let's say this one was my 18. Again, I would line up my 1/4 inch mark and cut. Same thing on the top. So if you have enough embellishments that is causing a problem, you can do it that way. If you really want to be safe, you could always mark a 12.5 by 18.5 inch rectangle on freezer paper and then iron it to the back and use that as your guide. I'm going to use my big ruler. This ruler happens to be 20.5 inches. So I'm going to set it up till I'm happy with where my 18.5 inch mark is. So that would be, so I'm lining up somewhere around the 2-inch mark on the bottom of my wheel on this basket. It doesn't matter, you can figure out where you want it centered. But do make sure that you have at least 18.5 inches going this way, and I don't. Let's move it down a little bit. And at least 12.5 inches going this way. Now if you did it with the freezer paper, you can actually see through the freezer paper so that you know it's coming out how you want it. I think that's good enough, so I'm going to cut. Well, this is when the really big square rulers come in handy for squaring up blocks that are applique or embroidery. So I need my 18.5 inch mark across the bottom, 12.5 inch mark along the side, and this is your last chance to make sure it's how you want it, because you could always trim a little more off of this side if you wanted to. 12.5, 18.5, cut, and cut. So there's my trimmed down duck block. From our white piece, we need to cut 4 strips that are 3.5 by 18.5. So I'm going to cut this down to 18.5 first, and I happen to be using my big square ruler again. You wouldn't have to cut it down to 18.5 first if you don't want to. You could always cut your strips down after. So half of 18.5 is 9.25, so I am lining up my 9.25 inch mark along my fold. I'm going to cut, and then I need to clean up one edge. So again, I can line up lines with my edge that I just cut as well as with my fold. And then I'm going to cut 4 3.5 inch strips. I actually turned this the wrong way for being, I'll go ahead and trim this side down too, because I don't want to pick it up and turn it. You really only need to clean up one edge, as long as you get the right one for your, whether you're right-handed or left-handed. So now my ruler's not wide enough to do 7 inches and then cut it in half. So I'm just going to cut 3.5. 3.5. So I just need 4 of those. I'm going to just cut all the way across. From my green fat quarter, I need 4 strips that are 3 by 18.5. So again, I'm going to cut it down to the 18.5. So I've got my 9.25 mark on my fold. So if you didn't want to cut it to 18.5 first, what you could do is cut your 3-inch strips off, and then you can use your long ruler to trim them down to 18.5. It doesn't really matter. So I'm going to straighten up this edge, and I'm going to cut it just like I did for my 3.5-inch strips, only this time they're only 3 inches wide. If I don't move that ruler, I can cut my 6, back it off to 3, and I'm not going to try to line up my 6 exactly. I would rather line up with a line than the edge of the ruler. I'm not, if I haven't just cut along it. So 3 and 3. So I will have 4 strips that are 3 inches wide. We are going to make scallops out of the green strips and applique them to the white strips. You can use whatever applique method you want. Raw edge, you could do starch and press, they're kind of big templates. This is the pattern for the templates, and it's only half pattern. It says fold here. So you can fold it, or you could trace it all out on freezer paper. I'm going to show you a method that I haven't done this year. So with this method, I traced my scallop pattern onto freezer paper. So all I care about is the scallop pattern, not the rest of it. So you could just fold it in half and cut the whole thing out together. I chose to trace it this way and then take it to a light box and trace the other half. Either way will work. If this was not symmetrical, I would need to trace from the wrong side. This pattern is symmetrical, so it doesn't matter how you trace it. Once you have it traced, and I did not add the seam allowances to the top, then I'm going to cut it out on my traced lines. Oh, and I did trace on the dull side of the freezer paper. And then I'm going to take it to the ironing board, and I am going to press the shiny side to the wrong side of my green fabric. And my ends and my bottom, my straight edges, are going to just match up with my strip. And then I'm going to cut, and I'm going to add the seam allowance as I go. So about 1/4 inch. I'll just cut the whole thing out. When I'm cutting it out, or when I'm finished cutting it out, I am going to clip one straight line into the V's in the scallops. I want to get really close, but I don't want to cut into the paper. So I will finish cutting this off camera. For the side scallops, you're going to match up the ends. For the top and bottom ones, you just need to get it on there so that you have enough room to cut a seam allowance on the ends. It doesn't matter whether it's centered, because we're going to be trimming away all the extra. Once I have cut out my scallops, leaving a seam allowance, then they get pinned to my white strips. The side ones are going to butt up against the edges and along the long edge. And then the top and bottom, you're going to want to find the center of your white and center the dip between the 2 center scallops right there. And then it's just going to be a matter of appliquing the fabric down. It's the same stitch as I've shown before when we're doing starch and press, but this time I'm turning the edge under my freezer paper as I go. So I'm going to come in the fold to bury my needle there. And then I'm just stitching, a couple stitches. Okay. And then when I need to, then I just turn the fabric under the freezer paper, and the freezer paper edge is giving me my edge to turn to. Just a few, like 1/4 inch, maybe 1/2 inch of where I'm stitching. I'm not trying to turn the whole thing. I'll stitch a few stitches, pause and turn it under. So I'm just following the edge of my freezer paper with this method. And when I get to those inside points, I'm going to take one stitch down here, a stitch here, and a stitch here to really hold it. So you can use this method if you want to, or any other applique method. I've appliqued my green, and because the bottom is a raw edge, I don't have to worry about how I'm going to get the freezer paper out. I can just open it up and pull it out. If you're careful, you could use it again, but I'm not using it again. So now I like to baste the raw edges. So I don't know if you can see it or not, but on this one I basted along here, and along here. And I do that so that when I'm sewing it to the next thing, it's not getting puckers and tucks or bubbling. So once I have all 4 appliqued, my next step is to take the edge ones, and the edge ones are the ones that don't have the point. And they are going to be sewn to both sides. Oh, before I do that though, I'm going to press these, and the duck should also be pressed well. And when I'm pressing applique, I'm usually pressing from the wrong side, and you can also put a towel under it because you don't want to make this completely flat. But you're just going to sew it on the edges with a 1/4 inch seam. I've sewn the sides onto the duck, and then I pressed in toward the duck. Now the next step is just the top and bottom. I'm going to do exactly the same thing. Just sew it on, and I have pressed it. So just like that. I sewed the top and bottom borders onto the duck, and this time I pressed away from the center out toward the border. And our block should now be 18.5 inches wide by 24.5 inches long. The last thing we're doing this month is the Redwork Blossom. You have 4 pieces of fabric in your kit for this: a white square, a red square, a green square, and a yellow square. Depending on how you decide to make it, you may not use all of them. This is the pattern that's in your kit. You could just embroider the whole thing in red if you wanted to. You should still have some red left from your duck. And then the yo-yo is made with the Clover small yo-yo maker. It's the green one. I haven't sewn it on yet because I need to trim down the block. This block is going to be trimmed down to 6.5 inches. You can embroider this with any stitch you want. I used a stem stitch. This ruler is going to be way too big, but it's what's sitting here. So if you are going to have somebody quilt your quilt when you're finished, edge to edge quilting, you may not want to add the yo-yo at all until the quilting has been finished. So 6.5 is there, that's too close. So when you're happy with it, you can just trim it up to the 6.5. So I trimmed 2 sides first. I'm going to rotate so I can either walk around with the ruler, or I can flip my piece around. Line up my 6.5 inch mark with the 2 sides that I just cut, and trim. Now, at this point, or after your quilt is quilted, I would applique the yo-yo to the base of the flower. So when you look at your pattern, you're not supposed to embroider the circle that's down there. That's the yo-yo placement. This is the pattern that's in your pattern. However, this is not what's in the picture that's on the front of the pattern. Instead, it's something that looks more like this. So I am going to include a link on the description for this video where you can go download this pattern if you would rather do it. So I appliqued it. I used the fabrics that were in the kit this time. That's why you have 4. This still needs to be trimmed down to 6.5 inches. You could also just use it for a Redwork pattern if you wanted to. If you would rather do that than applique. I used an open chain for the stem, but you don't have to. You could do a stem stitch, or you could do a back stitch. So you have a choice this month. You can do this block, which is the pattern that's in your kit, or you can do this block, which is a pattern you will have to download. I trimmed this one down off camera. I just wanted to say, I'm not going to show a tutorial for this. I have shown a tutorial on the techniques for this. This one, I used starch and press applique. And this one, I just traced the pattern and embroidered it. So it's either block. You're not doing both. You're choosing one or the other.